Howdy everyone, my name is Moonman, and today we're going to be going through everything we know about dungeon design in Ashes of Creation. We'll start with dungeon design from open world versus instanced, into the team's take on dungeon difficulty progression, PvP in dungeons, and dungeon locations. My goal with these videos is to cover all the relevant information so everyone can understand both the intricacies of the systems being implemented, as well as the basic systems and philosophies that lay the foundation. Let's get started. To begin, one very cool element of Dungeons & Ashes is that 80% of dungeons will be open world, while only 20% of dungeons will be instanced. For anyone that doesn't know, an instance dungeon is a dungeon that is separated from the rest of the world and you effectively load in by yourself or with a group to battle the content in the dungeon, meaning that only you or your group can interact with the environment and enemies within the quote instance. For most of us, we're used to MMOs having instance dungeons almost exclusively, so it's really awesome that the Ashes team is trying to flip the script on this one. With the majority of dungeons being open world, it begs the question as to how these dungeons will support multiple groups, and what happens when a dungeon is overrun with too many people. In the most recent AMA with Steven, he went into more detail about the different dungeon sizes, how dungeons will support different numbers of groups, and the team's take on creating friction in the world of Ashes. This last point being pretty important for not only dungeons, but gameplay around the whole world. Dungeon sizes will be different depending on the area. There are dungeons that will cater to individuals, ones that are meant for groups, and of course raids. There will be dungeons that are very large that will support a multitude of groups, as well as dungeons that will be particularly small that can only really support 1 to 2 groups. The Tower of Carfen is a great example for what we can expect for a large dungeon area. There are 2 sections of the Tower of Carfen, the wreckage of the city, below the tower, and the tower itself. The wreckage area is meant to support groups of 3 to 5 players, and based on what I could see in their Lore of Carfen video, the wreckage area looks pretty massive. I'm not sure how many groups this will support, but it looks like the expectation is that you'll need a group to clear out the mobs in this area. Side note, I have to say that the Tower of Carfen is insane looking. If other dungeons are like this, I might just lose it when I start playing Alpha 2. I mean, having to complete a jump puzzle to get into the area is crazy cool, and the attention to detail when it comes to the environment is amazing. Anywho, the tower, as Steven puts being the actual dungeon, is intended for full parties. A little background here, groups are maxed out at 8 players, so a full party being 8 total players. There are 6 levels in the tower, including the base level, and each of these levels will support 3 to 4 groups. So effectively, 24 to 32 players or so on each level of the tower. The tower is a pretty large structure and can be looked at as a vertical dungeon. I'm kind of thinking of this like Sword Art Online, with each level of the dungeon being a new floor of the dungeon stacked vertically, and as you make your way up the dungeon, each floor is harder than the previous floor. The team has actually weighed in on this a bit in regard to their philosophy of dungeon difficulty. Dungeon difficulty will increase the further a player ventures into the dungeon. Mobs and mob mechanics will become more difficult as you progress further, and terrain and environmental dangers will increase. That last point is particularly interesting to me because that means not only will the mobs be a threat, but there will be environmental dangers as well. Imagine some sort of traps or varying things that could affect your character status in the form of debuffs. I'm not sure, but there's definitely a lot they can do with environmental dangers to hinder groups and drive increased difficulty. I love this quote from Steven on this. Deeper, darker types of interactions will be found deeper in the dungeon. Within the Tower of Carfen, we can expect groups to spend quite a bit of time in the dungeon. Again, in the recent AMA, Steven said that it is not intended that groups go between levels, and that the intent is that a group finds a level and carves out a section that they will be hunting in. There may be some friction between groups fighting for mobs, and the team actually wants that to happen. They believe that a level of friction between players is important, likely because this drives more meaningful interactions and requires you as a player to figure out solutions because of the friction. This doesn't quite answer how the team will handle dungeon overpopulation, but based on their philosophy, it seems like they don't plan to answer that issue. They want friction to exist, and they want players to have to decide if being in an area is worth their time, or if they should move on and come back later. So basically, we'll have small dungeon areas and large dungeon areas that support varying numbers of groups. The team wants to have friction within these areas to force player decision making, and dungeons will get harder the further you make your way into them. The intent in a dungeon is that players will find a part of the dungeon to farm and hunt around that area. One thing that is not quite clear with the intent to have players farm a specific area within the dungeon is how that will affect their ability to engage with varying boss types within the dungeon. Bosses in dungeons can fall into different boss types and are as such. We have elites, hunting ground bosses, mini bosses, and dungeon bosses. What we know is that boss respawns will be randomized within certain windows, and they can spawn in a number of different locations. Bosses may also spawn based on certain conditions being met, such as when a story arc or an event begins somewhere in the world. But considering that the team intends for groups to carve out a farming spot in the dungeon, what happens when there isn't a single boss spawn in that area? I think it makes more sense that groups would move through the dungeon and farm multiple areas and try to progress through the dungeon, as well as find different bosses throughout the dungeon to try and acquire as much loot as possible. Maybe this is addressed by loot tables in dungeons, but I'd be surprised if bosses didn't have better loot tables than general mobs. I guess we'll find out more on this in the near future. One of the most interesting things associated with open world dungeons is the opportunity for PvP and potential griefing. As stated before, the Ashes team believes friction is an important aspect of the game. When you think about friction within open world dungeons, coupled with Ashes of Creation PvP system, it creates a very unique dynamic. What I mean specifically by the PvP system is the player corruption system. I want to give some background on the corruption system because it's contextually important to understand how it creates a super unique dynamic within the scope of open world dungeons. It's important to understand some bosses, both dungeon and raid, will be room locked, so PvP will not be something that takes place during certain encounters. However, the majority of encounters are open world and PvP may be prevalent. Basically, player corruption is a player status effect that exists in the realm of PvP. Players are default, quote, green, meaning they are non-combatant. If you attack another non-combatant or someone who has become a combatant, you will move to a purple status, meaning you are now a combatant. You are, as a combatant, attack a non-combatant, you will become corrupted. If, as a non-combatant or a combatant, you attack a corrupted player, your PvP state will not change. And lastly, if you are corrupted and you attack a non-combatant, you will gain more stacks of corruption. And if you are corrupted and continue to accrue more stacks of corruption, you are effectively stacking a debuff that reduces your skills and stats. This will stack all the way until you are completely ineffective in combat. So why is this important in the context of open world dungeons? This means that if you are experiencing a heavy amount of competition in an open world dungeon, you have to ultimately make a decision. You can A, try and mob tag and steal away mobs to try and counter the increased competition. You can B, leave and spend time moving to a new area. Or you can C, engage in PvP and potentially become corrupted. What makes this so interesting is that your group could choose to kill a group of players and risk the normal chance of losing the fight and missing out on even more experience and loot, but more importantly, you have to be extremely decisive about when you initiate PvP because you kill one group of non-combatants, the people with a green status, then run into another group that is contesting your area of the dungeon, then you may not have an option to fight that other group. This largely depends on how quickly corruption dampens your stats and abilities, but to double down on this, when you are corrupted, your spawn point is no longer a normal respawn point. You spawn at a random location in the vicinity of your death. Should your whole group die while corrupted, it could be very tricky to coordinate to group back up and re-engage in the dungeon. The only way to remove corruption is by dying, and you may need to die multiple times to remove all the corruption, obviously depending on how much corruption you accrued. You can also remove corruption by gaining experience. This means that it could be advantageous to kill off the competition in the dungeon, and if you're able to gain experience quick enough, may not be a huge impediment to your group. This just creates so many opportunities for impactful decision making, and I love that in a game. When your decisions carry weight, you spend time thinking through what your ideal route should be, given your current situation. Ashes is trying to pack the game full of these types of scenarios. That's why they think friction is so important, and I 100% agree. In any MMO I've played, the most interesting moments have come from times where there is friction with other players, groups, or guilds. For anyone that played World of Warcraft Classic, you might remember having insane multi-raid fights in the middle of Blackrock Mountain, or your raid using weird tactics to completely avoid a fight because you didn't want to lose your world buffs. I remember passing out invisibility potions to my entire raid so we could all go invisible and remove the buff when we were right on top of an enemy raid to surprise them and wipe them easier. I digress. The point is, friction is a huge component of MMO gameplay. Not only does it force decision making and unique solutioning, but it also forces you to interact with other players around the world, whether that's in a good capacity or a bad capacity. The scale of risk to reward forces us as players to decide what we should or shouldn't do and how that will affect us both near term and long term. The last thing I want to touch on as far as dungeons are dungeon locations. It's important to separate these into two because there are dungeons on land, but there are also underwater dungeons. Let's start with land dungeons. These will be located throughout the map in between the 85 node locations. As the nodes advance, they will influence nearby points of interest, which includes dungeon bosses, regional bosses, and raid bosses. We don't know exactly how many dungeons there will be, but it seems like there would be at least one dungeon per node location. My hope is that there are more than one per node, but 85 dungeons to begin with is quite a lot. Additionally, the loot tables and difficulty of encounters will change or adjust based on the node's influence. I don't want to dive too far into underwater dungeons because there is a ton to cover on the naval system itself, which I'll be releasing a video on in the coming week or so. And more importantly, we don't know much about underwater dungeons. I mean, when I went digging to try and find out more about them, I ended up watching a live stream video the team did in 2017. Literally a stream during the Kickstarter for Ashes. Based on previous live streams though, we know the team is working through naval content. As an example, raft caravans, seemingly not a major component of the naval system, but does showcase sailing with water currents, movement, and navigation. And I'm sure they're keeping tight-lipped about naval content until they have made significant headway on the systems and design. All that said, what we do know is that there will be underwater dungeons and they are connected to the naval content. Naval content will not be introduced at the beginning of Alpha 2, but the team plans to make an update during Alpha 2. My best guess here is that underwater dungeons will be similar to land dungeons, in the sense that there will be both small and large underwater dungeons supporting different amounts of players, but since there are technically no underwater nodes, I don't think their loot tables and difficulty will change as a result of node influence. There will likely be conditions that can spawn certain bosses within the dungeon, but my assumption is that these conditions could be somewhat different than the conditions that do the same when it comes to land dungeons. Separately, we do know that there will be naval combat, mobs, and even raid bosses. I'm personally pumped about how much the team has planned for naval content. The world won't stop at the ocean like in many MMO. The ocean will be an integral part of our game experience in Ashes of Creation. That's all I have on dungeon design for now. There are a few topics I didn't cover, like dynamic scaling in dungeons, glint, and how the team is combating players' ability to Zerg bosses. The short and sweet is that dungeons will dynamically scale based on numerous factors like level, previous experience and performance, and so on. Glint is basically your primary way to generate gold in Ashes, and boss zerging is bringing an absurd number of people to do an open world boss, even though the boss may have been intended for 40 players or less. The team will be implementing things to make zerging less possible, especially if the zerg does not follow the mechanics of the boss. Anywho, I'll be making a video on raid design from mechanics, raid sizes, compositions, locations, looting systems, and more. I hope to release that this week, but also have a couple of other Ashes videos in the works. Point being, I have a lot of content on the way, and I'm working through it as fast as I can. My main goal is delivering quality to all of you that are watching and bringing in all the little tidbits of information we've gotten from the live streams that the team does. Thank you all so much for joining me, and I appreciate all of you that have subscribed so far. If you like Ashes of Creation content, then go ahead and subscribe because I got a lot more on the way. See you on the next one. Moonman out.